a ruthless war in the jungle. Although it may sound like a movie, the world's #1 military power was defeated and humiliated by an independent faction from a small Asian country. That's right, North Vietnamese insurgent forces managed to repel American militias and win the war. In today's video, we will explain how this historic event unfolded, focusing on the mistakes made by the United States, which underestimated the conflict and the enemy. Get ready to delve into the eastern lands of jungles and landmines. Welcome to military history. The Vietnam War was part of a broader regional conflict and a clear manifestation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, each with its respective allies. At the strategic level, the US knew why it was fighting the war: to prevent communism from gaining strong footholds in Asia and expanding territorially without control. However, they failed to articulate clear goals and objectives at the tactical level, leading to confusion about the desired outcomes of the military intervention. The lack of clarity about the overall purpose of this war resulted in inconsistent formulation of policies and strategies by the Pentagon. It seemed like the Americans had intervened without a concrete plan, only with the intention of stopping communism. On the contrary, the North Vietnamese knew exactly what they were doing and why. They were fighting for an independent and sovereign Vietnam. Consequently, the goal was to expel the Americans, to isolate South Vietnam from its economic and military support. They finally achieved their goal by avoiding a decisive engagement in the South and resorting to hit-and-run tactics, causing US forces to withdraw from Vietnam. During the conflict in this country, the United States made a series of egregious mistakes that ultimately cost them the defeat. The CIA played an inefficient role in this military incursion, failing both at the strategic and tactical levels. They couldn't assess the true scope of the war and childishly underestimated the true power of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. As if that weren't enough, knowing that the development of the military intervention was not favorable, they began manipulating data and figures to try to calm the population and not lose the support of the citizens. The serious part was that they were lying to their own troops in Asian terrain, causing catastrophes on the battlefield, which was already extremely dangerous. Terrain plays an extremely crucial role in any war. In the case of Vietnam, it was decisive. The Asian country is a land of swamps and jungles, enormously hostile and dangerous for foreigners, but ideal for Viet Cong fighters to attack and hide in a jungle they knew like the back of their hands. The United States conducted many napalm bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, which only alienated the local population against the Americans, as they couldn't degrade the combat strength of the Viet Cong. The fiery jungle maze was hell, where North Vietnamese forces moved much better than the Americans. Another crucial reason for the United States' defeat was China's unconditional support for North Vietnam. This support was not justified only by China's strategic security concerns, but also by the sense of international responsibility to help brother comrades and promote the anti-imperialist revolution. The Asian giant considered itself a natural ally of the oppressed peoples of the world in their struggle for national liberation, justifying efforts to help North Vietnam. As if that weren't enough, the personal friendship between Chinese leaders and Viet Cong leader Ho Chi Minh was an additional factor for this unwavering support. The National Liberation Front of Vietnam also had strategic, military armament and supply support from the Soviet Union, which was in a very clear period of prosperity. All these setbacks for the Americans, including logistical support for the Viet Cong, disadvantages in terrain, underestimation of the enemy, and a lack of real motivation to fight, led to one of the most infamous milestones in the military history of the United States. We are talking about the Tet Offensive, an episode that marked the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive consisted of a wave of attacks by communist guerrillas in the south of the country that shocked the American public and ended up being decisive for the outcome of the war. despite being repelled by Washington's troops with significant losses for the North. On the night of January 30th to 31, 1968, an advance force of 84,000 insurgents from the National Liberation Front of Vietnam and troops from the North Vietnamese Army broke the tacit truce of the Lunar New Year and launched an offensive on the 6 major cities of South Vietnam, the sector that was being supported by the United States. The surprise was such that it allowed the war advance to reach Saigon, the capital of the South, creating a strong impact on the attacked troops. The Vietnam War was the first conflict in history to enjoy widespread media coverage outside the Army's censorship, contributing to its unpopularity. The Tet Offensive was the largest military incursion of the entire war and had a profound effect on the American public opinion, which received numerous and varied reports of combat conditions, mostly distorted. Generally, the American military's communication apparatus managed to distort information and make the population believe not only that they were winning, but also that the Viet Cong was an inferior, diabolical, and irrational enemy. However, pretending to change or hide what happened that night at the end of January 1968 was like trying to cover the sun with your hands. The photographs were shocking and reached the population, as the example below shows.
What I see when I look at that photo today are 7, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, badly wounded. It's painful to look at.
After overcoming the initial panic and chaos, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops organized themselves, halted the assault, and counterattacked, causing numerous casualties to the communist forces based in the north and headquartered in Hanoi. However, President Johnson's administration could not demonstrate to the public that the offensive had resulted in an American victory, or that the North Vietnamese goal of provoking a general insurgency in the South had failed with serious losses. On the contrary, the idea spread that North Vietnam was a notable enemy, capable of mounting large offensives, that the Allies in the South were as brutal as the adversaries, and that the Vietnamese people were closer to Hanoi than to Saigon. These circumstances deepened the unpopularity of a conflict in a distant country that the average American could not locate on the map, and for which they did not understand why they had to die. Additionally, the inhumane consequences for Vietnamese civilians in many American operations also reached U.S. news, generating even more rejection of the conflict's continuity. In this context, American casualties were increasingly seen as senseless, the sad result of a whim. Unlike World War II, any American citizen could see the consequences of the war directly on their television through special correspondence, as the one we will see next.
Tomorrow, the military communique will read, "One American was wounded in an engagement with an unknown size enemy force. Enemy casualties are unknown." But you've seen how it really was. Heroism, danger, fear, all rolled into one. Words don't describe it. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, near the Cambodian border.
The Vietnam War was the first fully televised war, creating both followers and opponents in U.S. homes. News about atrocities and horror stories like the My Lai massacre made the war highly unpopular among the population. This particular massacre, which occurred in 1968, consisted of a savage and brutal act by American troops. It involved the systematic rape of women and girls in the assault on a Vietnamese village, followed by the execution of more than 500 inhabitants of that population, with no justification whatsoever. In this outrage, soldiers ended the lives of 182 women, 173 children, including 56 babies, and 60 elderly people, in addition to destroying 247 homes, killing all livestock, and burning the rice fields. These actions had strong repercussion in American society. Over 100 U.S. veterans gathered between January 31 and February 2, 1971, in Detroit to denounce the massacre that their army was subjecting military personnel and civilians to in Southeast Asia, as well as their own soldiers. Convened by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, an organization founded 4 years earlier in the heat of pacifist protests against President Johnson, 1,000 veterans supported these accusations. First soldiers' testimonies were impressive. The veterans themselves shared experiences in which their country's militias mistreated prisoners and abused Asian elderly women. They also denounced the senseless dynamiting of villages and the torture of prisoners. These abuses consisted of cutting ears and scalps and then throwing them from helicopters into the river. The most serious thing was that sometimes the prisoners were not enemy soldiers, but civilians from small villages lost in the jungle that were ravaged by American troops. All these abhorrent actions were contained in the CIA's Phoenix program, which included torture and murder in its fight against the Viet Cong. For the veterans, these were not isolated events but a systematic behavior in the U.S. military's actions in Vietnam. That's why they wanted to highlight it through their testimony at the Detroit Convention. The allegations did not gain much media attention until a Navy lieutenant, John Kerry, who would later become Secretary of State during Barack Obama's presidency, appeared on April 22nd of that same year before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be the body and voice of those gruesome testimonies in a speech that became historic.
Because we came here to undertake one last mission, to search out and to destroy the last vestige of this barbaric war, to pacify our own hearts, to conquer the hate and the fear that have driven this country these past 10 years and more.
Clearly weakened in the public's eyes, the U.S. government was forced to order the withdrawal of the remaining American soldiers in Vietnamese territory. During a speech at Tulane University on April 23, 1975, President Gerald Ford said that the Vietnam War had ended as far as the United States was concerned. Let's see a historical footage snippet from a subsequent press conference where he reaffirms that sentence.
Ms. Thomas, the war in Vietnam is over. It was sad and tragic in many respects. I think it would be unfortunate for us to rehash allegations as to individuals that might be to blame or administrations that might be at fault. It seems to me that it's over. We ought to look ahead, and I think a congressional inquiry at this time would only be divisive, not helpful.
The president's speech was devastating news for the Southern Vietnamese, who pleaded for U.S. support, while the North Vietnamese prepared for what would become their final assault on Saigon. When Ford spoke, the Congress and the nation saw Vietnam as a losing proposition on which the United States needed to cut its losses. Official records show that by then, the number of Americans who had died in the Asian country was nearly 60,000 men. The withdrawal of U.S. troops facilitated the immediate collapse of the South. The final offensive took place in April 1975. On the 30th of that month, the Communists took Saigon and forced the surrender of the South Vietnamese. On July 2, 1976, the country was reunified under the name of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war had ended. Beyond the struggle for territories, this subsidiary conflict was a contest of superpowers, capitalism against communism. Within the world order of the time, the defeat of the United States meant a strong blow to its military and international power, which until then enjoyed complete immunity, while China and the USSR were the most favored. Every war leaves scars on both nations and individuals. In American history, few conflicts divided the United States more brutally than the Vietnam War. For over a decade, this conflict convulsed all aspects of American life. The war led the executive and legislative powers of the government into a bitter conflict for control of U.S. foreign policy, a clash that ended with Congress legislating severe limits on that once untouchable presidential power. Perhaps the cruelest consequence of this war in the United States was what it did to a generation of young Americans. It sent thousands of men into self-imposed exile and turned their neighbors and nation against them. It turned thousands of people into extremists and caused violent riots in the streets of cities and on university campuses. Let's remember that many soldiers were young Americans, like the protagonist of this testimony.
So I looked up and spotted it was an NVA. He had a green uniform, had an AK, and it was like a quick draw old thing. I opened up in him, he opened up in me. Yeah, I'm afraid it works that way. But he's lying up there on the trail.
Roger that. We haven't taken fire. You got hit.
I got hit in both legs.
Vietnam emerged from the war as a powerful military force in Southeast Asia, but its agriculture, businesses, and industry were disrupted. Much of its countryside was destroyed by bombs and defoliation, and it was plagued with landmines. At the same time, its cities and towns suffered serious damage that would take decades to rebuild. On the other hand, the United States, with its demoralized military and its deeply divided civilian electorate, began a process of accepting the defeat in what had been its longest and most controversial war to date. The human costs of the long conflict were harsh for all involved. It wasn't until 1995 that Vietnam released its official estimate of deaths in the war, up to 2 million civilians and around 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The U.S. military, for its part, estimated that 58,126 American soldiers died in the war, the vast majority of them under 30 years old. The U.S. intrusion into a poorly planned, underestimated, and lie-based war in an effort to sustain the world's power at the time is a wound that the American society has not fully healed to this day. This brings us to the end of today's video. We thank you for staying until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.